News stories continues on this extraordinary day, which began with a gunman opening fire on Republican congressional members at a baseball practice. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise struck in the hip, is recovering after surgery. 3 other people suffered gunshot wounds, also in recovery, some of them in quite critical condition, as we understand. Then, late today, the Washington Post reported that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is investigating the President of the United States for possible obstruction of justice. Joining me now, Jennifer Rubin, who writes the Right Turn column at the Washington Post, Jason Johnson, politics editor at The Root and politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University, and MSNBC contributor Josh Barro at Business Insider. Jennifer, I'll start with you. In some ways, this is confirmation of what had been indicated, but just to take a step back, we're in fairly uncharted territory. There's an active special counsel investigation of the President of the United States, a criminal investigation that's open and that we now know about.
Correct. And you're right. I did assume that this was going on, both because James Comey last week laid out a case that you could tell was an obstruction case, and because Robert Mueller, of course, is a very esteemed lawyer and former FBI chief and would know an obstruction case when he sees it. This is confirmation, and I think that confirmation does a bunch of things. First of all, it should put everybody on notice in that administration that you should not abide by the president's lawyer's advice not to get your own lawyer. You should get your own lawyer. People should be very, very careful about telling the truth in public, telling the truth to investigators. This is a trap for the unwary. And lastly, I think it's time for the people in Congress, on the Senate and on the House side, particularly the Republicans, to put aside some of this partisanship, stop trying to throw sand in the gears here and ask real questions of the witnesses and do their job.
Josh, you had a contrarian take the other day about Republican behavior on Capitol Hill, which is that actually you said they have been more adversarial or more willing to exercise oversight of a Republican president than you would have anticipated. Explain.
Well, or at least, they certainly could be doing a lot more to hold Trump accountable, but they could also be doing a lot less. I mean, if you look in the, we're, 150 days into this administration, the amount of damaging hearings that have been held on the Hill, the hearing that was held with Comey and such, and in some cases with fairly aggressive questioning, especially from Richard Burr and then also from some other members on the Senate Intelligence Committee, they don't even have to have these hearings.
Right. I mean, that's the key to me, is that the chairs have had hearings that, if they were maximally falling in line, wouldn't even have seen the light of day.
And I think to some extent they would have liked to be covering for the president more, but the president has made it difficult for them. I mean, especially by firing James Comey. Because he made it look so obvious that he was trying to interfere with the investigation, it was hard for people like Richard Burr to come up with a plausible reason as to why they would be slow-walking it. And so, their willingness to carry water for the president is not infinite, and if it becomes embarrassing enough for them to not hold the hearing, then they have to hold the hearing.
Well, and that connects it to Jennifer's point, too, because in many ways this now moves we don't know what's going on in the special counsel, right? It's sort of in a somewhat black box. But it does move to Congress, because the question I asked Leonard Lance, we all know the president was thinking about firing Robert Mueller.
Right, exactly.
Which, if you followed Donald Trump for a week, you would know that. If you watched him fire James Comey. Yeah. But of course, that, ultimately, it's like the boundaries for all this action ultimately is what will Congress abide and what they won't.
It's a political question. And I think
fundamentally,
a lot of this is, how bad does it have to get for the Republicans in the House, because the impeachment has to start there, to say, we got to get rid of this guy. It's getting too much of a problem. Will it take the 2018 elections? Will it take being wiped out? Will it just take an additional scandal? That's really what we're looking at here, because the evidence seems to be pretty clear. We already knew that Trump was investigation the moment that James Comey said, oh, yeah, I already gave that stuff to Mueller. So the question is whether the Republicans want to get ahead of this, or they want to wait until all the shoes drop and they might get crushed by it.
Although we don't know what part of what's so strange about all this, and it makes it strange for everyone's behavior at the heart of this, is when you go down to what the basic, Jennifer, core facts are. What did the Russians do in terms of just what their efforts were in the campaign, which appear to be quite extensive? Did they receive any aid or help from U.S. persons? Were those persons associated with the Trump campaign? Did the Trump campaign collude in any way, or were they infiltrated in any way? The entire facts of that, most of those are still hidden. And everything that is out in the open on the obstruction question is sort of there for us to see. But any Republican member of Congress or anyone operating in this political environment is doing so largely blind.
Yes, and this really is the adage that the cover-up can be, if not worse, at least more visible than the underlying crime. I would say, however, that the Republicans have lots of constructive things they could be doing if they wanted to get to the heart of this. And one of this is investigating his financial ties and getting to the bottom of the emoluments problem, which does intersect with the Russian problem. What money does he have coming in? Who did he have dealings with? Did he really not have any deals with the Russians? What did he know or not know about Mr. Flynn and his association with Russians? So there could be a variety of other forum in which Congress could get involved. I would say there was a third event today that in any other day would have gone unremarked upon, but today of all days, it was probably third or fourth down the list. And that is Senator Grassley, who's been a much more fervent advocate of the president and defender, has agreed to open hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee on the firing of James Comey. And that is also a big development. That's another committee, and that is really pretty much in parallel with an obstruction investigation by the special prosecutor.
Yeah, and to that point, the question here, in terms of the behavior of all the parties involved, is how does the White House, is the White House able to maintain discipline on the president to not essentially do something catastrophic, right? Because ultimately, he has been his own worst enemy in the behavior that he has himself led. I mean, this story is a story because the President of the United States fired James Comey for what appear blatantly pretextual reasons.
Right, but the problem with protecting the president from himself is that for Robert Mueller to keep his job, the president has to wake up every morning and decide not to fire Robert Mueller. For him to lose his job, the president only has to wake up once and decide that this is the day he's going to fire Robert Mueller. There was reporting, I think it was the New York Times, Maggie Haberman, basically about people keep asking, you know, why aren't people telling the president no? And the answer is people are telling
all the time,
all the time. He's not listening to them, and they're telling him no increasingly because they've become more alarmed. But just because his staff tries to protect him from himself doesn't mean he'll listen to them consistently.
And one of the other things that comes into play, you're going to see a whole bunch of people sort of, you know, updating their LinkedIn profiles right now. Because if you're in the White House, you're thinking, look, the little things, the little favors that I've done for this president, the way I've assisted him, I could get wrapped up in this dragnet. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. It's going to have a lot of people flip on him.
Someone once told me almost every administration sees someone go to jail. It's very easy to break the law in the White House, even if you're very careful, and this White House has not been careful. I want to talk about what happened this morning and the sort of resonance of that. And you know, we're hearing all this, you know, when you watch this develop in our extremely polarized atmosphere, it can be sort of exhausting and dispiriting in that there's immediately this sort of blaming, and there's look for who is the villain, and sort of connection from normal politics like Bernie Sanders, he volunteered for Bernie Sanders, to ghastly attempted murder. Right. It seems to me, actually, well, I guess, Jennifer, I want to know what you think about this. I think it's important, in my view of this, it's important to draw the line between speech, even if it's rabid, even if people scream at their members of Congress, whether they're in the Tea Party or the, quote, resistance, and violence. And that's a hard line that it's really important to maintain and not to do too much connecting between those two.
Yeah, I think there are two ideas that are somewhat in tension. On one hand, we have a president who has just plowed down Democratic norm after Democratic norm. He incited violence at his rallies. He has been someone who has not respected the peaceful operation of democracy. And you do want to put a stop to that. You do want to condemn that. On the other hand, and this is important, people who do this really are not simply acting as a political actor. There's something terribly disturbed, terribly wrong, terribly evil about them. And you have to separate those people from even irresponsible speech by the president or irresponsible speech in Congress. So I think we want a robust democracy, even one in which we don't like very much how people are conducting themselves. And on the other hand, make sure that we have a correct, appropriate, sober response when these horrible events happen.
And Jason, I think it's important for folks that are liberals, opponents of the president, whatever, to just sort of force themselves to the exercise of if the shoe were on the other foot in this circumstance. And be like, well, that had nothing to do with me. Because obviously I find this horrendous, and those aren't my politics. I would never do something like that. Would you extend that sort of basic framework were it someone else, right? And that seems to me like a really important exercise for everyone to go through, just emotionally and cognitively in these atmospheres.
You know, I completely agree, Chris. And I think another thing that's at play here, this is a guy who abused women. Right? I mean, he has a violent background in general. I think the lesson I hope we all learn from this, on the right and on the left, and I think, you know, thinking and praying for Steve Scalise to be okay, is that we oftentimes, politicians will make compromises rhetorically for votes or for policy and not recognize how it could exacerbate these kinds of issues. Steve Scalise has his own issues with people he may have spoken to in the past.
Yep.
He didn't do that because he's a white nationalist. He did it because he was trying to get votes. And sometimes politicians do things for votes and don't recognize it could activate those kinds of people.
Yeah, I guess so. But I just think that's dangerous thinking in some ways, right? Like, I think, like, this idea of activating to me is like that you start to sort of hem in what you. It's a free country. People should say so. What you should not do is incite violence, to Jennifer's point, and that has happened. But that to me, it's just important to hold that line between incitement and speech and action.
Right.
The thing I'm afraid of, and the thing that I think members of Congress are afraid of, which I think is why they were very nice to each other today and sort of came together about this, it's not so much the rhetoric as the increased agitation among the public, not just the sense that the government's doing things they don't like, but that when the other side wields power, it is doing so in an illegitimate way, that the government is not responsive to voters, that things are rigged. And I think when you have public sentiments like that, when people believe that normal politics doesn't work, then people can become more inclined toward violence.
I definitely think there is something to that. Jennifer Rubin, Jason Johnson, and Josh Barrow, thank you all. That is all in for this evening.